Hey all, it's Matt, your average gamer. Today we've got something different for you and something a little crazy as well. I created a challenge for myself to fight all main bosses, each with a different build, specifically builds that haven't appeared on my channel yet. The rules I created were simple. I'd avoid overpowered builds like the Blasphemous Blade, Night Comet, Pure Bleed builds, etc., and would choose a random build I made up from my inventory to face each boss. I'd have to respec each time and would also have to do builds in every damage stat category. Now in order to respec, I'd have to take out Rennala and first set up a base camp and would have to use 2 other great runes to move forward. Would also not be allowed to use summons, no repeat ashes or somber weapons, and stay at level 150 on New Game Plus 7 for this challenge. And you can see on the map here, we only have Rennala open at this point so that we can respec in between each main game boss and come up with a different build for each different boss. This is going to be really fun. There's a ton of different builds in this video. By the way, everything's timestamped below as usual. Before we continue though, if you see any links for ExpressVPN in the description below, it's the amazing VPN service I've been using lately. It's a good way to keep your browsing safe, and there's 3 additional months for you in the link below. I appreciate all the support from you guys, and don't forget, you can now become a member too for extra mini builds and member specific polls. Checking out our inventory, seeing what talismans we have and whatnot, it's time to use our first build against Margit. Margit, I had never done a pure frost build before, so I elected to use dual frost warhawk's talons here to fight Margit. This was actually harder than I expected, as after the initial proc, it became a tad bit challenging. Luckily, you can reset frost with fire, always a good combination, so always keep something on hand if you want to get another proc. The damage with these was relatively good, and they're undoubtedly my favorite straight sword in Elden Ring. Now, Margit would take good damage here, and even on New Game Plus 7, he's only got around 11,000 HP, which isn't a ton, and we're able to get a second frost proc there as well, as we continue to mix in jump attacks, successive attacks, everything we can combo together, using Chilling Mist on both Warhawk's talons, getting the coat for both, and doing as much magic damage and frost damage as we possibly could. Margit would eventually fall to all of the frost and magic damage we're able to do, and our awesome journey would continue on to greater heights, as we were going to continue forward to face Godrick and every main game boss in Elden Ring using a different build for each one. And after each boss, I'll show equipment and the exact build. For this, we had 2 Warhawk's Talons plus 25 preferably with Chilling Mist. Any seal will do. We had the Battle Mage set on, Dragoncrest Great Shield Talisman, Magic Scorpion Charm, Shard of Alexander, Rottenwing Sword Insignia, Magic tier, and then the Faith tier for buffs. Stats here, this is an intelligence-based build, so basically get intelligence as much as you can. Put a little dexterity in there too because you're using the Warhawk's Talons, and then we went for 60 Vigor too. There's the 150 stats. Godrick the Grafted was another story, so I figured if I used double Highland axes, I would have an advantage with Warcry. This is because we'd be stacking Roar Boost with the talisman included. I opted to put them in blood for even more damage, as Warcry has a multiplier on the special charge hits that can build up bleed even quicker. This is somewhere around 2.5 times the amount of bleed when you land a successful special Warcry charged attack. So as we push forward, mainly using those special charge attacks to try to get Godrick into phase 2, we're able to do a substantial amount of damage, even though we did take many hits like we did with Margit here, even though both Margit and Godrick thankfully only took 1 try each, as they should. And shortly we're going to be able to get Godrick into phase 2 using double Highland axes with bleed, something I never really tried before. The combination with Warcry ended up being quite good. When you do land the hits, you do get a lot of damage out of them. In phase 2 of the fight, he got locked into doing his slam repeatedly, giving me an extra challenge to deal with. As you saw with Margit, by the way, each build and setup will be shown after the boss if you're interested in trying any of them out for yourself, and there's some really fun non-meta stuff here. And as I continued to apply pressure, I looked for windows to use Warcry and just making sure that I used the Roar and then followed up with the charged attacks, because that's the best bet here. That's what you're going to get the most out of, boosted by the Roar Medallion and both the passives on the Highland Axe. In time, Godrick would eventually fall to the power of Roars, although he was certainly putting up more of a fight than he normally would. Margit or Godrick would kill me, but don't worry, I died many times to the later game bosses. I kept a tally that I'll share later in the video. Bosses that actually don't usually give me that much of a hard time gave me a more harder time than usual, and some of the other bosses I was surprised with certain builds how much damage it did. As we move forward though, there's definitely some surprises in both the builds and how everything ends up playing out as well. And as I continue to do jump attacks with the Highland axe and then mixing in those special charge attacks, Godrick would eventually vanish into nothing. And then we're going to be going over build and equipment again, as we'll continue to do with each boss, making a new build for each one. This is going to be a ton of fun. Can't wait to show off all these. Equipment, we have 2 of the Highland axe in blood affinity with Warcry on them, the Raptor's Black Feathers, Dragoncrest Great Shield Talisman, the Roar Medallion of course, Axe Talisman, Ritual Swords Talisman, and then we have the Charge tier, and then you can throw in the Faith tier for buffs. Let's get into stats. This is a little bit of a quality weapon when you're in blood, so you can go with either Dexterity or Strength if you want to pump points into one, and then focus the rest on Arcane to get the bleed. While not technically mandatory, I fought the Magma Wyrm to get to Altless Plateau instead of the Grand Lift. If you take this route, the Magma Wyrm is technically a mandatory boss. This I opted to go for the small Envoy's Horn, which in total honesty I had never really used that much. You see, the Envoy's Longhorn is way better. It's not only good, it's actually great. But the mini bubbles here, this was a different challenge in its own. Each bubble did solid damage with my build and setup for it, but even so, a single bubble of holy damage is only going to get you so far. For the head as much as possible, going Doot each time for small amounts of damage. Unlike the bigger bubbles, it doesn't seem to build up much posture damage. But if you're able to hit him in the head, it was doing enough, I guess. In time, the Magma Wyrm would fall victim to the use of single bubbles, which was kind of hilarious. This was a really funny build to do. I hadn't really used the small Envoy's Horn. It's a fun weapon to try out. If you haven't tried it, I suggest using it just for fun purposes. It's kind of stupid, and yeah, it's not going to be great for the majority of bosses in the game, but if you're able to pull it off against a boss, it definitely feels good to take them down with the single bubbles from the Envoy's Horn. Amazing the versatility Elden Ring gives us and allows us to fight bosses in whatever ways we like with a ton of variety. That was a really good time in the end. I wouldn't fall victim to the Magma Wyrm either, resulting in 0 deaths from the 3 bosses we've taken on so far. But don't worry, I'm gonna die a lot later in the video and we'll go over that too. Let's get into equipment. The mini bubble build here, we have the Envoy's Horn. Any seal will do. You can use the bubble helm for even more damage. I didn't have it on this character. Dragoncrest Great Shield Talisman, Shard of Alexander, Sacred Scorpion Charm, Ritual Swords Talisman, and then we have the Holy tier. And you can use something like the Faith or Defense tier. Let's get into stats. Much like the bigger Envoy's Horns, the Ash of War itself scales entirely with Faith, so pump as much as you can into your Faith stat, and you're going to get a lot of damage out of the different variety of bubbles. Radahn would be my first real boss deaths. I died about 4 times to Radahn, as I chose to use the Candlestand as my weapon. Completely unfamiliar with its Ash, having rarely used it. It does do excellent fire damage and scales solidly with both Faith and Strength. After we were able to close our distance, do our initial buffs, and get closer to Radahn, I was able to pull off the Ash of War on him. I would end up being able to use it for a significant amount of damage, as it has a wide spread and does massive fire damage. Ash of War on this seems to be mostly Faith, and if I had to take a guess, and I only used it against one boss here, this is definitely going to be a weapon that's better against larger targets and bosses as opposed to smaller ones. Candlestand ended up being a really good time, and since I like Faith and Strength weapons, it fits right in with what I would normally use, but again, I wasn't familiar with this one particularly because I just hadn't used it much. I knew about it, didn't try it on many different bosses, and you're going to see here, it has the potential to do a ton of damage. To be honest, I was actually surprised at the damage amount it can do and that it's capable of, but unfortunately it is relatively slow and you seem to get locked into the animation, particularly if you hit the button too many times as the Ash can continue going. Certainly hit Radahn hard and he was quickly sent to Phase 2. Phase 2 for me always results in one specific thing, avoiding the meteor, then immediately rushing Radahn. This is simply because he has to set up for Phase 2 and often gives you a small window to get some extra attacks or hits in. So as I avoid the meteor and head towards Radahn with the same basic concept, we're going to use the Ash of War on this of course because that seems to be the coolest part about this weapon. So I continued to raise the Candlestand in the air until I saw Radahn eventually vanish into nothing. What a crazy weapon. I might have to do a future build on this one as well, as the ridiculous damage potential it has is certainly there. For our on-the-spot build and setup, let's get into equipment. We have the Candlestand plus 10 preferably, any seal will do. We have the Fire Monk set on, Dragoncrest Great Shield Talisman, Shard of Alexander, Fire Scorpion Charm, Ritual Swords Talisman, the Fire tier, then you can use something like the Faith or Defense tier. Let's get into stats. Stats, this seems to be not only a strength and faith weapon, but if you're not hitting stuff as much with the Candlestand specifically, the Ash of War, most likely because it's pure fire damage, pump up your faith, you're going to get a ton of damage out of it. The Draconic Tree Sentinel was next, and for this I opted to use Spinning Weapon, the magic version of Spinning Weapon, and added in Frost scaling to see if I could get a proc for extra damage. This fight ended up being one try, and Radahn did kill me 4 times. He was the first boss to kill me. The Draconic Tree Sentinel wouldn't kill me, but this fight was by no means easy. The Draconic Tree Sentinel would fight me as tough as he possibly could, getting in hits that would frequently stop my attempt to use Spinning Weapon Ash of War on him. It's never that difficult of a foe for most builds, but we certainly aren't running around with any superpowered magic builds here. We're using Spinning Weapon. We are getting the Frost procs on him, which is a nice bonus and some additional damage, but it's nothing too amazing here. Though Spinning Weapon, using it on the Morning Star is by no means bad, as you can get in solid damage. In time though, he took considerable damage, with me getting, I believe, 2 procs of Frost in total, while also getting the added damage that Frost can give you. Despite me getting beat up a fair bit in this fight, he would eventually fall and leave me wondering if Spinning Weapon, well, the magic version, could be really good with the right setup. The damage here is definitely there, and it's certainly enjoyable to use too. After a literal down to the wire build where I basically had no HP at this point, we were finally able to take down the Draconic Tree Sentinel with the Spinning Weapon Ash of War and our Frost damage and magic damage. Let's get into equipment. Equipment, we have a Cold Morning Star with the Spinning Weapon Ash of War, any seal will do, Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, Shard of Alexander, Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, Magic Scorpion Charm. Then you can use something like the Magic tier or the Consecutive Successive Attack tier, the Thorny tier, or you can use the Faith tier for buffs as well. Let's get into stats for this build. This is an intelligence build, and then depending on your affinity, it's either a dexterity or strength build. I invested in strength here, got decent damage out of it, and was able to proc Frost as well as get a good amount of magic damage too. Golden Shade, oh man, this was not too easy. I died like 4 or 5 times to Shade. The most I've died to him on a run through the game in a fair bit of time. My thinking here was to use the Brick Hammer in combination with Black Flame Blade, but the problem is, Black Flame Blade is just downright bad. It's incredibly short, much like drawstring grease, and I often find myself getting hit trying to apply it again. It truly does need a buff for it to compare to Blood Flame Blade and other weapon buffs of its type. It didn't matter, in the end I was able to finally take my time, pace the fight, and get in hits as often as I could. Trying to apply it again each time in between the hits was certainly difficult though, as I wouldn't often pull it off as much as I needed to. It does do a good amount of percentage damage when you get in a hit, but the duration of 10 seconds or whatever it is simply just too short. Hammer was also a funny choice too in reality, as I was using a short weapon buff on a weapon that has really short reach. I like the Brick Hammer's damage and scaling, posture damage too, but it has very short jumping attack and can often lead to some misses if you're not exactly precise. This resulted in many mishaps with Golden Shade, and the fight admittedly went longer than it normally does for me. There's a ton of different builds you can use to take on Golden Shade and destroy him rather quickly, as he doesn't have a ton of HP, but for the build that we were using, it just wasn't the best setup specifically for him, and the short duration of Black Flame Blade made it all the more difficult. If you're having difficulty with Golden Shade, by the way, one of the best things you can use is lightning, as he has 0 lightning resistance, so any lightning build, Bolt of Grand Sax, Ancient Dragon Lightning Strike, there's a whole bunch of different things you can do there. He'll take the full complement of damage and you'll destroy him fairly quickly with lightning. And Golden Shade would fall too, to a build I hadn't really ever tried much in Black Flame Blade, and at least we're going to be heading on to Morgott now. Let's get into equipment. We have the Brick Hammer and Heavy Affinity. This is a Strength and Faith build. Godslayer Seal, we had part of the Crucible Knight set on. Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, Fire Scorpion Charm, Claw Talisman, Axe Talisman, and then we had the Charge tier. You can use the Fire tier, the Faith tier for even more damage. This can turn into a solid build if only Black Flame were a little bit longer. Let's get into stats. The build of my favorite type. You're invested in Strength and Faith here, so get your Strength up, get your Faith up. Black Flame Blade's going to scale with Faith, and the Brick Hammer will scale with Strength and Heavy Affinity. Morgott is a personal favorite boss for me, as I've always felt like he paces the end game in a way. It's kind of like the boss fight is telling you in advance that the game is about to speed up and you're going to have to go with it. Morgott would kill me around 4 or 5 times unfortunately, because I decided to use the seemingly less useful Flame of the Redmanes for this fight. I was curious as to whether or not it still had utility, and to be honest, I'm not entirely sure that it does. Sure, it does decent fire damage with the setup we came up with for it, and it scales off of strength and weapon level and AR. The potential is there, no doubt, since it has a little bit of range too, but its big selling point used to be the posture damage, of which it does basically none now. To go into this fight without armor, and I'm not sure why, using the Giant Crusher with Flame of the Redmanes, and I was eventually able to get enough hits to Morgott to bring him down, but it was certainly no easy task. Flame of the Redmane's days are certainly behind it, and we're now living in a world where Elden Ring posture breaking isn't as easy as it once was. For those that are new, Flame of the Redmanes used to do 40 poise damage per each use of the Ash of War, and it could break most bosses in between 2 and 4 hits. It was an amazing Ash of War, and unfortunately it got nerfed. Let's get into equipment for what is now a fire setup. We have the Fire Crusher with Flame of the Redmanes, any seal will do, Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, Fire Scorpion Charm, Ritual Swords Talisman, Shard of Alexander, and then the Fire tier and Fate tier for some buffs. Let's get into stats. Stats, everything here is going to scale off of your strength stats, so you can go with the Giant Crusher, put it in heavy affinity, you can pump up your strength, and then Flame of the Redmanes, you'll at least get some fire damage off of it as it scales with strength. Fire Giant is always intimidating. One of the best pieces of advice that it could ever give for the big guy is look past his giant-sized self and pay more attention to his movesets, which you'll realize are very slow. The Fire Giant, I chose to use the Star Fist, randomly putting Storm Stomp on it but not using it that much. Instead, I'd go for Bloodflame Blade and see how the damage of fist weapons, which I don't frequently use, would turn out for the big guy. To be fair, it certainly did solid damage to him and gave justice to the name of the Star Fist. The Bloodflame Blade will give us additional bleed on top of the base bleed, and we've elected to use these in heavy affinity here. I was impressed with the damage. By the way, I want to mention real quick, if you're not subbed to this channel, now's the time to sub. If you've been following all along to this point, definitely hit that subscribe button. You're not going to want to miss out. We're going to be doing guides, builds, Elden Ring content like this, challenge runs, upcoming lore videos, and even a little bit of PvP content as well. So back to the Fire Giant, as we got in as many hits as we possibly could, looking for bleed procs with Bloodflame Blade and Heavy Star Fist, see how much damage we can build up with successive attacks, and again, seeing how much bleed procs we can get, and see if we can take chunk damage off of his 64,000 HP that he has on New Game Plus 7. Fire Giant no doubt can be a pain. Getting him to second phase can take a little bit of time with his HP, but concentrate on the ankle, the weak point, you'll get in a lot of damage and those bleed procs that we mentioned. Phase 2 was a little bit more difficult as he rolls around a lot and his weak points, unlike his ankle in Phase 1, became more difficult to hit. This was a challenge with a short range weapon like the Star Fist, as I even would end up flat out missing him a handful of times. But the damage was undoubtedly there, and I was able to occasionally proc bleed for massive chunks of his HP bar. After rolling around a bit and a couple of mishaps by me, he would eventually end up falling to the power of the Star Fist, which are actually quite good. I did do a build on them a while back, but we used Earthshaker with them and focused more on the Ash of War. Using them for posture breaking or bleed is a really solid way to take down bosses in Elden Ring. As we run around here, we end up having to finish off the Fire Giant by chasing him down, and much like Elden Beast at the end of the game, when he gets down to low HP, he tends to spam a lot of his attacks at you. Feels kind of cheap at times, but it doesn't matter in the end because you're just going to have to run under him, get in as many hits as you can. You don't have to go for his weak points when you're using something like Bleed, and we took down the big guy using the Star Fist and Bloodflame Blade. We're going to get into equipment for this solid setup, and the Star Fist we're using in heavy affinity with Bloodflame Blade, and then we were using any seal. We had Albric set on with a mix of different things, Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, Millicent's Prosthesis, Lord of Blood's Exaltation, and then you can use the Thorny tier and something like the Fate tier for buffs. Let's get into stats. For stats, this is a strength build with the addition of Bloodflame Blade, so as long as you have 15 faith and with the Faith tier you can get to 25 to do buffs, you can go for all strength on this build. get a ton of bleed, you can get posture damage with the charged attacks. These are awesome. Godskin duo, I decided to do something a little ironic for them. I chose to use the Godskin peelers, but not in bleed, no. With lightning slash and the lightning affinity, maximizing our lightning damage as much as I could. I opted for sleeping pots in combination with jump attacks here to stack up damage. This was a dexterity build and focused on as much lightning damage as we could possibly do. I always do different variants on these builds, including fire, lightning, and even things like poison jump attacks with Kindred of Rot's Exaltation. The variety is there when it comes to twin blades, so you're never locked into doing the meta bleed stuff all the time. It certainly shreds, but there's ways to do amazing stuff with different affinities as well. Never feel locked behind one thing. If you're using just bleed, there's a ton of larval tiers. There's a total of 18 of them per playthrough. Feel free to change it up and you could try different affinities and different things to use. And you can even use your jump attacks if you like them as well. As you can see here, we're getting solid damage with the jump attacks and then lightning opposed to bleed. The Godskin duo wouldn't be too much of a problem in the end, as they wouldn't stop me from continuing on this awesome adventure to take on more formidable foes that more often stay awake. All seriousness, these guys are crazy weak to sleep, so I couldn't resist. As I fought them solo without pots pre-nerf, it was challenging, but I wouldn't call it fun. To be fair, at least I can say I was able to beat them before the second Godskin became more passive when they got patched. What would happen eventually is they would patch the Godskin duo, because initially the two of them would come at you at the same time. They would literally be poking you to death or doing a variety of up-close attacks. So they made it and nerfed it so that one Godskin duo would stand back and the other one would take the lead, and it would be consistently that way throughout the fight, making them a little bit easier to solo. Down goes the Godskin duo, and we're going to be moving on soon to Beast Clergyman and Maliketh, and then we have obviously all the endgame bosses to do. This is going to continue to be fun as we're going to use a variety of builds. For this one, let's get into equipment. Equipment, we have two Godskin peelers and lightning affinity with lightning slash for the extra lightning damage. Any seal will do. We have the Raptor's Black Feathers on, Dragoncrest Great Shield Talisman, Rotten Winged Sword Insignia, Lightning Scorpion Charm, Claw Talisman, and then you're going to want the Lightning tier, the Thorny tier, or the Fate tier for buffs. Let's get into stats. Stats is a pure dexterity build because we're dealing with lightning here, so go for all dex, as much dex as you can possibly get. Clergyman and Maliketh would only end up taking me one try. I know, spoilers here, but they're never as tough as they seem. Out of the two, Beast Clergyman's moveset is far worse in my opinion, as Maliketh's attacks are often widely telegraphed. For this fight, our story would continue with the Ash of War Glintstone Pebble, and it wasn't bad at all. It scales with weapon level and your intelligence stat, and it can be boosted, if I recall, from better intelligence scaling on the weapon itself. Here we chose to use the Anspire, Rapier, and Frost so we could potentially get a proc and make our lives a bit easier. You're going to see me use a combination of Glintstone Pebble and then the hits with the weapon itself during Phase 2 to mix it up, and to also hopefully get a Frost proc on Maliketh so we can do additional damage to him with the Glintstone Pebble Ash of War. During Phase 2, Maliketh will often either back up for range attacks or close in. When he closes in, you can go under and roll behind him for him to miss you entirely. Also get some hits in while you can. For this build, we got a Frost proc on him eventually, as well as continuing to do solid damage with the Glintstone Pebble Ash of War. And by the way, if you want even more damage, this can be boosted by 8% by using the entire Spellblade set that you get from Rozier. So if you want even more damage, that's an option for you. I know, it's not the best looking set in the game. It doesn't offer a lot of resistances or poise either. There's not a lot there as far as the Spellblade set. But anytime you're using a Magic Ash of War, it'll boost it by up to 8%. So if that's worth it for you, if you're primarily doing PvE, it's an awesome set to use with different Magic Ashes of War. Yeah, this is definitely something that you're going to want to boost as much as possible. Like regular Glintstone Pebble, it has a fairly decent amount of range. You can utilize this on most bosses to good effect. And if you had Terra Magica, you'd be able to boost it that way too. I don't think I had it on this character, didn't bother to set it up. But I was fine with the damage we were getting from it. The Glintstone Pebble Ash of War was doing plenty for this fight. Like regular Glintstone Pebble, it's also really fast to cast this as well, and you can use it pretty consistently. So it's something that you could basically spam, and you can easily roll out of it to avoid different attacks. Like Maliketh can do different stuff here, and we're still able to cast and get hits on him. and then we went under him there. There's the frost proc. At this point, you'll get additional damage with Glintstone Pebble. Maliketh would eventually fall too on this fun run through Elden Ring, and we'd be left with 3 boss battles left and 3 more builds to go on this run. And after he vanished and we're going to be moving on to more bosses and more builds, we're going to get into equipment for this one and this setup for the Glintstone Pebble Ash of War. Now we have the Anspear Rapier in Frost with Glintstone Pebble. It's got Rot on it, but we didn't proc Rot. Any Steel will do. Spellblade set, Ritual Swords Talisman, Shard of Alexander, Magic Scorpion Charm, Dragoncrest Great Shield Talisman. Then you can use something like the Magic tier and Faith tier for buffs. Let's get into stats. Stats for this setup were heavily invested in intelligence to get the extra magic damage on the weapon, but mainly because that's how the Glintstone Pebble Ash of War is going to scale. The higher your intelligence and the better scaling on the weapon, the more damage you're going to get out of the Glintstone Pebble itself. And as you can see there with Beast Clergyman and Maliketh, it was a solid option. Gideon, man, this was the first time he killed me in 10 plus runs at least. So my idea here was to use a quality Nagakiba with different greases and repeating thrust. Well, this build and setup wasn't bad by any means, but once he's no longer in monologue mode, he becomes a different kind of annoying. He could actually become really frustrating, and on New Game Plus 7, he could 2-hit you with 60 vigor with almost any of his attacks because his spells do so much damage. He killed me twice in the end before I realized I should just pressure him consistently so he couldn't get a cast off. Once you're on New Game Plus 7, any of his casts can just completely chew through whatever amount of HP you have. It doesn't seem to matter. He does a ton of damage. He's all offense. But lucky for us, he has low HP, low poise, and you can easily stun lock him. If it weren't for his low health, poise, and long monologue at the beginning that we usually take advantage of, he'd be a formidable foe as he's got some serious offense to contend with. Though I was able to pressure him into a corner, eventually using different greases on the quality Nagakiba to poke my way to victory. But hey, a win is a win. We've got bigger fish to fry. You know what I'm talking about. In Godfrey, Radagon, and Elden Beast, we'll be doing 2 more builds. I'm going to combine Radagon and Elden Beast into one build because technically speaking, you have to fight them back to back. And in short order here, we're going to go over equipment, everything you need to know for this setup, and we got 2 more setups to go. Equipment, we have quality Nagakiba with repeating thrust. We're using greases on. Any seal will do. Ritual Swords Talisman, Shard of Alexander, Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, Dragoncrest Great Shield Talisman, and then you're going to want the Thorny tier. Use the Faith tier for buffs like I normally do. Let's get into stats. Stats, this is a quality build, so you want to go with strength and dexterity, and then obviously I focused on having 60 vigor as well. We got good damage out of the Nagakiba, and we're able to use freeze grease, blood grease, and mix it up. Godfrey I knew would be an issue, and he killed me around 8 or 9 times, the most of any boss on this run. The issue with Godfrey is I wanted to do a cast mix build with Butcher's Knife, Flame Art Affinity, and Lion's Claw in combination with Burno Flame. This was a full faith build, and a great option for most bosses, but unfortunately Godfrey isn't really one of them. Burno Flame's animation can avoid some of his attacks, which was cool, but Lion's Claw is often dangerous to use as his swings almost always hit you. Does solid poise damage, but on New Game Plus 7, poise is upped by about 30% or so for bosses, so I'd essentially have to get in 5 or 6 of these without a reset to posture break him. I considered my options and wanted to keep it fun, so I worried less about the posture breaking part and decided to use Burno Flame anytime I get the opportunity to, because at this point, he's got 0 fire resistance, he's going to take a decent amount of damage from that, and it'll also take a decent amount of damage from a Flame Art Butcher's Knife with Lion's Claw. He gets ready for his stomp. Always make sure you're nearby to do whatever attack you'd like to him, because at that point, he gives you a free window to attack. But be careful because he's going to follow up from then on using the stomp, which you'll have to either jump or roll to dodge each time. Keep in mind, by the way, that each stomp he does needs to be dodged adequately. At least every time he comes near you, you're going to want to pay attention for that foot going down so you can avoid that, as you can get hit with it in any part of the arena. Usually I would end up phasing him, and during phase 2, he became a bit of a pain with some of his animations. You really have to pay attention here to not get grappled because there's a slim chance you'll survive. You'll occasionally manage at 60 vigor to survive certain grapples, but avoid it if you can, as the physical damage Godfrey is capable of in Horaloo is insane. Almost all of, if not all of, Godfrey's attacks are going to be physical damage, so keep that in mind if you're going for resistances before the battle, or if you're thinking of armor. If you go higher for physical resistance, you may be better off. But on New Game Plus 7, he can probably do 100 vigor worth of damage with certain attacks and grapples. And of course, during Phase 2, he can do the stomps again and slam downs, and when he initiates that, everything after that is going to stomp throughout the arena again, at which point you can roll or you can choose to jump over it, which actually does make certain animations like jump attack builds, or if using something like the Black Knife, you can avoid the stomps very frequently while dishing out a ton of damage to Godfrey. After a bit of running around and a few mistakes later, well, many mistakes, Godfrey would fall to my build. I was happy to see this one work out, as I like the Lion's Claw and Flame Art combination with giant seals. Pretty cool build all in all. I really do enjoy Faith builds. If you know my channel well, you know how much I enjoy them. They're a ton of fun to use. We're going to be doing a little bit different of a variant that also involves Faith for Radagon and Elden Beast, so stay tuned for that. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have the Butcher's Knife and Flame Art affinity with Lion's Claw. We have dual giant seals. We have the Raptor's Black Feathers, but you don't really need it. Ritual Swords Talisman, Shard of Alexander, Fire Scorpion Charm, Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, the Fire tier, and then you can do the Faith or Defense tier. Let's get into stats. Stats, we're heavily invested in Faith here. Since we're going for fire damage, Flame Art affinity is a perfect complement to the incantations we're going to be using as well. This is a very solid setup that you could use for the majority of Elden Ring. Flame Art is always a good choice. Got an Elden Beast for the final and biggest task we'd have to take on, and for this I elected to respec just a little bit but opt for another Faith type build. We tried Giant Hunt and Flame Art and mix in Black Flame incantations. I wanted something solid and also viable for the final boss, and to be honest, I found it. Giant Hunt and Flame Art affinity did massive damage to Radagon, and he was destroyed rather quickly to the amount of damage the Knight Rider's Glaive can do here. I was surprised, even knowing he has 0 fire resistance, at the power of the Flame Art Glaive. Radagon would disappear, and we'd be moving on to the longest fight of our adventure, the final fight, Elden Beast. Of course, he would get some last-minute slams in here to take some HP off, but it wouldn't matter in the end. We were getting really good damage out of this, consistently using Giant Hunt until Radagon finally disappeared. At this point, we're going to fill up FP, and then we're going to do any buffs we can possibly fit in before we go on to the battle with Elden Beast. Elden Beast was wild, to say the least. Given his resistances and over 31,000 HP on max difficulty, he was a little bit of a pain to deal with. Lucky for us, we've got Giant Hunt for some added poise damage, as well as Black Flame Ritual, an incantation I rarely use. Add in some percentage damage on top of that consistent poise damage we're going to be going for with Giant Hunt and Flame Art affinity on the Knight Rider's Glaive. The combination between these two is what I elected to use to fight the final foe. The last two builds being Faith-based was primarily because I love Faith in Elden Ring, as the variety and fun things you can do with it are unmatched for me. Giant Hunt will get good AR here in Flame Art, and each successful hit will do close to 40 poise damage. We need about 5 in a row without a posture break to successfully break him. Posture will reset after 6 seconds of not being hit, which means if he runs away or goes up for his rings, that's almost always going to reset Elden Beast's posture. Random note, if you're watching all the way to this point and you're not subbed, now is the time to sub and be part of an awesome Elden Ring channel and community. The Discord is also in the description below. If you need any help in the game or advice, feel free to ask, as we're always there to help. Seriously, the Discord has been fantastic so far, so if you're looking for any help, if you're looking to trade items, if you need any advice on how to build stuff even in the early game, I'm always there. We have mods that are there. We have people that are there constantly, ready to help if you need any advice and to point you in the right direction to come up with powerful, strong, and even fun builds. As our battle continued, Elden Beast somewhat got on my nerves a bit. He chose to run away rather frequently, which made things a little bit more difficult. Attempting to build up posture as much as I can, because if you can get to the point where Elden Beast does Elden Stars, if you break him around then, you get a huge advantage in the fight and can make the second half of the fight so much simpler. Because if you break Elden Beast during Elden Stars, you'll get a bit of invulnerability that'll negate most of the damage, and if you break him early, he could not be able to get Elden Stars off at all. It was by far the longest contest I had during this run, but to be fair, Radagon and Elden Beast only took around 3 or 4 tries, less than half the tries it took me to take down Godfrey. Mainly and primarily because of the fact that as epic as the final fight can be for some, it's mostly a stamina test. If you can keep up, you'll do well. If you can't, Elden Beast is spamming attacks and running will exhaust your resources and it'll end in your defeat. About patience and paying attention to his ranged attacks. Aside from that, he's not all that tough. Elden Beast would eventually end up falling to Giant Hunt, and we'd be able to complete our challenge shortly here, as we came up with another build that was able to take down a big foe by doing a substantial amount of posture damage and damage in general in the Flame Art Giant Hunt Knight Rider's Glaive. Before we're able to take down the big foe, he's going to do his second set of rings at this point. Now, when he does the second set of rings, one thing to keep in mind here is as you're jumping through them and you do not want to get hit with the final effect that does a ton of holy damage, keep an eye on Elden Beast, as he's often going to spam either his fire attack or the blades at you at that point, which if you get hit with the blades can actually stun you and you'll get stuck in the circle. So always pay attention to where he is and dodge his range attacks on top of the rings. As my name may already tell you, I'm pretty much just average when it comes to these games. I love Souls games. I played Dark Souls the entire series. I played them a ton. I started at 2, played 3 a whole bunch. 3 was what got me into the series. And Elden Ring, obviously, I love. It's probably my favorite game of all time. But I'm mainly average at these games. If you learn movesets, use different builds, you can get past any boss. If you get stuck, there's always help out there too. They're not that bad. When it comes to 2 of the hardest bosses that I think stop people, and I know Maliketh is one, but he doesn't have a ton of health. As far as the Fire Giant Elden Beast though, Radagon Elden Beast, I feel like a lot of people get stuck there, or they're like me when they started out playing the game, the fight just goes on too long. But you gotta remember, it's more of a stamina check than anything else. Having patience is key. If I can give you the best piece of advice, especially for the final boss, is just to have patience. He's going to run away a lot. I think he was originally designed to use Torrent of the Horse because he does run away rather frequently. Catch up with him, dodge his ranged attacks, and if you can get his physical attacks up close, they're extremely easy to dodge, and you can punish him because he has long windows after where he'll basically just stand there and you can hit him consistently. Poise damage is always a solid option for Elden Beast, and we're going to take him down in a second here after he tries to grab us. A very easily avoidable attack if you roll to the right under him, and then we can hit him. Finish off Elden Beast in what was the longest fight, the longest battle of this entire video. And by the way, we managed to finish the challenge. Yay, we did a different build for each boss. Let's get new equipment for this one. Equipment, we have the Flame Art Knight Rider's Glaive with Giant Hunt on it. We had dual Godslayer Seals. We also used the Ritual Swords Talisman here, Shard of Alexander, Fire Scorpion Charm, Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman, and then you can use something like the Fire Tier, and then if you want to use the Charge Tier, if you're using charged hits, the Faith Tier for buffs. Let's get into stats. Stats here, I did use a Larval Tier compared to my last build, which was pretty close to this one, and we just moved stuff around a little bit. I think I went for a little bit more Faith, just moved a couple of points around, but this is another powerful Faith-based build. That was my first challenge run on my own. It was fun. I died a total of 47 times, with Godfrey claiming 8 or 9 of those deaths, and second to that was Morgott and Golden Shade, who both took 4 or 5. Radahn took exactly 4, I believe. I had around 4 or 5 non-boss deaths during the run as well. And the random deaths I had, I was knocked off a cliff by an eagle in Stormville. I fell off a cliff on my own by accident, and I died on the Eagle run in Farum. That's one of the worst runs in the game. I almost always die there. Lately, I've been getting lucky getting past there, but yeah, that part with the Eagles, very difficult if you're trying to run through. At the end of the day, I had a really good time. I'm hoping this was fun for you guys too, and informative as well. Thanks for watching. If you guys want to see more different videos like these, let me know in the comments below. This was really an interesting way to take on bosses as I used random weapons and ashes and mixed in different incantations and less used weapons. If you're looking to change it up, I recommend out of all these going with one of the last 2, as those were both the ones I had the best time with, although the mini bubbles was hilarious. That was a lot of fun too. If you're not on the Discord, definitely be sure to join that, especially if you need help with anything. There's over 500 people in there now. It's an awesome growing community. And if you're not subbed and you love overpowered PvE builds, be sure to check out all the awesome builds that are on my channel. Thanks for watching. As always, I will catch you guys there.